There are ancient structures that shouldn't still be here, not because they were fragile, but because no one expected them to matter this long. They were built without writing, without machines, and without any promise of being remembered, yet they still shape the land, controlling movement, hiding the dead, marking silence with stone. Most of them never explain themselves. They don't celebrate power. And that's what makes them unsettling. Because when you look closely, these places reveal planning, repetition, and restraint, long before cities, empires, or history as we know it. This is not a search for myths or lost worlds. It's a quiet journey through the choices humans made when stone was their only language, and space was how they spoke. Khirbet Keyyafa. The site known as Khirbet Keyyafa sits on a hill overlooking the valley of Ela, positioned in a way that immediately suggests control rather than comfort, because from this height the surrounding landscape opens outward in long, uninterrupted views, allowing anyone standing here to monitor movement through one of the most important natural corridors in the region, a place where routes converge and where passage could be observed, regulated, or denied long before travelers reach the hill itself. What distinguishes Khirbet Keyyafa from many other ancient sites is the clarity of its planning, because this was not a settlement that grew slowly and organically over generations, but a place that appears to have been laid out deliberately, with thick stone walls encircling the summit, carefully aligned gates, and an internal layout that reflects forethought rather than improvisation, suggesting that whoever built it already knew exactly what they wanted this place to be. The walls of Khirbet Keyyafa are massive, constructed from large stone blocks fitted together without mortar, forming a fortification that would have required significant labor and coordination, especially given the steep terrain and the limitations of Iron Age construction methods, and this alone tells us that the settlement was backed by authority, organization, and access to resources beyond what small village communities typically possessed. One of the most unusual features of the site is the presence of two gates built directly into the city wall, a rarity for fortified settlements of this period, where a single controlled entrance was usually preferred, and this architectural choice has led to ongoing debate about whether the gates served purely practical functions or whether they were tied to symbolic, administrative, or territorial considerations that extended beyond simple defense. Inside the walls, the settlement follows a clear pattern, with buildings arranged along the inner perimeter of the fortifications, creating a continuous belt of structures that both reinforce the wall and define the internal space. A design that appears efficient, defensive, and highly intentional, reinforcing the idea that this was not a casual settlement, but a planned installation. Archaeological evidence suggests that Khirbet Keyyafa was occupied for a relatively short period, perhaps only a few decades, which raises important questions about why so much effort was invested in a place that was not meant to endure for centuries, and whether its purpose was tied to a specific historical moment rather than long-term habitation. Radiocarbon dating places the site in the early Iron Age, around the late 11th to early 10th century BCE, a period marked by shifting political landscapes, emerging regional powers, and contested territories, making the location of Khirbet Keyyafa particularly significant, as it sits near a natural boundary zone between different cultural and political groups. This strategic placement suggests that the settlement functioned less as a typical town and more as a frontier outpost, designed to project control, monitor movement, and establish presence in a region where authority was still being negotiated rather than firmly established, which may explain both the strength of its fortifications and the brevity of its occupation. Among the most discussed discoveries at Khirbet Keyyafa is a fragmentary inscription found at the site, written in early alphabetic script, which has been interpreted in various ways but broadly indicates the presence of literacy and administrative activity, reinforcing the idea that this settlement was connected to a larger political system rather than operating in isolation. However, the inscription does not provide clear answers about who built the site or how it was governed, and interpretations vary widely, reflecting the broader uncertainty that surrounds the early Iron Age in this region, where archaeological evidence often outpaces our ability to assign clear cultural or political labels. What remains consistent across interpretations is the recognition that Khirbet Keyyafa was not a spontaneous or defensive reaction to immediate danger, but a calculated construction, planned in advance and executed with precision, suggesting that its builders were responding to long-term strategic concerns rather than short-term threats. The absence of extensive rebuilding phases indicates that once the settlement was abandoned, it was not reused or significantly altered, which is unusual in a region where sites were often reoccupied repeatedly over centuries. And this clean break in occupation suggests that the purpose Khirbet Keyyafa served was fulfilled, or became irrelevant relatively quickly. From a human perspective, it is easy to imagine the experience of living here, standing on the wall at dawn, watching the valley below slowly come to life, aware that this elevated position placed you both in control and in isolation, separated from surrounding communities by both stone and intention. Unlike larger cities with markets, temples, and dense populations, Khirbet Keyyafa would have felt disciplined and restrained, a place where daily life was shaped by vigilance rather than routine, and where presence itself carried meaning, because simply occupying this hill sent a message to anyone passing through the valley below. That message did not need to be spoken, written, or enforced constantly, because the walls themselves communicated it clearly, through their scale, their placement, and the effort embedded in their construction, making it understood that this landscape was no longer neutral ground. In this way, Khirbet Keyyafa represents a shift in how space was used in the ancient world, from loosely defined territories shaped by movement and tradition, to more rigidly controlled zones marked by architecture and planning, reflecting broader changes in social, organization, and political authority during the early Iron Age. What ultimately makes Khirbet Keyyafa significant is not any single artifact or inscription, but the coherence of the site as a whole, the sense that every element, from the walls to the gates to the internal layout, was designed to serve a unified purpose, even if that purpose remains only partially understood. Rather than offering clear answers, Khirbet Keyyafa invites us to consider how power was expressed before it was formalized in writing or monumental architecture, through strategic placement, controlled access, and the quiet assertion of presence on the landscape. And like many ancient sites that resist simple explanation, it reminds us that the past often reveals itself not through dramatic events, but through careful decisions made by people who understood their world deeply, even if we are still learning how to read the traces they left behind. Dolavira. Dolavira lies in one of the harshest landscapes where any ancient city ever chose to exist, on the dry island of Kadir in the Rann of Kutch, a region where the ground hardens into salt for much of the year and fresh water is never guaranteed. And yet it was here that people of the Indus Valley civilization decided not merely to survive, but to build one of the most carefully planned urban centers of the ancient world. What becomes apparent almost immediately at Dolavira is that this was not a city that grew by chance or gradual expansion, but one that followed a strict vision from the beginning, divided into clearly defined zones that separated administrative, ceremonial, and residential spaces, suggesting a society that valued order, regulation, and long-term planning in a way that still feels surprisingly modern. Unlike many ancient cities where walls exist mainly for defense, the walls of Dolavira seem equally concerned with organization, because the city is divided into a citadel, a middle town, and a lower town, each elevated slightly differently and separated by stone boundaries, creating a layered landscape where movement was controlled and meaning was built directly into the terrain. The most extraordinary feature of Dolavira, however, is not its walls or its layout, but its relationship with water, because in a place where rainfall was unpredictable and rivers were absent, the city's survival depended entirely on the ability to collect, store, and manage seasonal water with extreme precision. Massive stone reservoirs were cut directly into the bedrock, connected by channels designed to capture monsoon runoff and guide it into storage basins, ensuring that water was conserved rather than wasted. And these reservoirs were not small or symbolic, but monumental in scale, lined with stone steps and reinforced walls that suggest long-term use and regular maintenance. What makes this system remarkable is not just its size, but its integration into the city itself. because water management was not treated as a peripheral concern handled outside the settlement, but as a central organizing principle around which the city was built, reflecting an understanding that control of water meant control of life. The precision with which these reservoirs were designed indicates advanced knowledge of hydrology, seasonal cycles, and stone construction, and it suggests that the planners of Dole Vera were not merely reacting to environmental challenges, but anticipating them years, even generations, in advance. Archaeological evidence shows that the city was occupied for several centuries, enduring environmental changes, shifting climate patterns, and periods of stress. Yet the urban framework remained consistent, implying strong social continuity and shared civic responsibility rather than chaotic rebuilding. Unlike later cities where monumental architecture often serves to glorify rulers or gods, Dole Vera's most. Impressive structures serve practical purposes, reminding us that power in this society may have been expressed not through temples or palaces, but through the ability to provide stability, predictability, and survival in an unforgiving environment. One of the most intriguing discoveries at Dole Vera is a large signboard made of stone blocks bearing symbols of the Indus script, mounted prominently near one of the city gates, which suggests an attempt at public communication, identity, or authority, even though the script itself remains undeciphered. The presence of such a sign implies that Dole Vera was not an isolated settlement, but part of a wider network of cities that shared symbols, standards, and possibly administrative systems, reinforcing the idea that the Indus Valley civilization was far more interconnected and organized than once believed. Daily life in Dole Vera would have been shaped by routine rather than spectacle, by maintenance rather than expansion, as people moved through clearly defined streets, accessed shared water resources, and lived within a system that emphasized balance between human activity and environmental limits. At the same time, the city's eventual decline reminds us that even the most carefully planned systems are vulnerable to forces beyond human control, as changing climate patterns, reduced monsoon intensity, or shifts in trade networks may have slowly undermined the delicate balance that sustained life here. What is striking is that Dole Vera was not abandoned abruptly, but gradually, suggesting adaptation and resilience rather than collapse, as populations adjusted, relocated, or restructured their lives in response to changing conditions. Standing among the ruins today, one does not feel the presence of conquest or sudden destruction, but rather the quiet aftermath of a city that had fulfilled its purpose and slowly faded as circumstances changed, leaving behind stone reservoirs, silent streets, and unanswered questions. Dole Vera challenges many assumptions about ancient urban life, because it shows that complexity does not always require abundance, and that innovation often emerges most strongly where resources are limited and mistakes carry severe consequences. Rather than representing excess or ambition, the city reflects restraint, foresight, and collective discipline, qualities that allowed it to endure in a landscape that offers little forgiveness. In this sense, Dole Vera stands not only as an archaeological site, but as evidence that some of the earliest cities were built not around power or display, but around cooperation, planning, and a deep understanding of the environment they depended upon. And even now, thousands of years later, the stone channels and reservoirs of Dole Vera continue to speak quietly of a civilization that understood something fundamental, that survival is rarely about dominance and far more often about balance. Udayagiri Caves. The caves of Udayagiri are carved into a quiet sandstone hill near present-day Vidisha, and unlike many ancient sites that announce themselves through scale or distance, this place reveals its importance slowly, through proximity, because the caves are not hidden deep underground nor raised dramatically above the landscape, but cut directly into the living rock at eye level, as if meant to be encountered naturally rather than discovered. These caves belong to the early 4th and 5th centuries CE, during the rise of the Gupta period, a time often described as a classical age in Indian history. Yet what makes Udayagiri remarkable is not elegance or decoration alone, but the way political power, religious belief, and landscape come together here without clear separation, forming a space where authority was not only exercised, but made visible. Unlike residential cave complexes meant for long-term monastic life, the caves at Udayagiri are relatively small and restrained, suggesting that they were not designed for habitation in the ordinary sense, but for specific moments, rituals, and symbolic acts that carried meaning far beyond the physical space they occupied. The carvings inside the caves are deliberate and controlled, emerging directly from the rock rather than being applied to it, which already signals permanence, because carving into stone is an irreversible act, one that transforms the landscape itself into a statement, rather than simply placing a structure upon it. Among the most striking features at Udayagiri is the monumental relief of Varaha, the boar incarnation of Vishnu, shown lifting the earth from cosmic waters, a scene that is not merely religious imagery, but a visual expression of restoration, order, and protection, themes that resonate strongly with the political climate of the time. This relief is not tucked away in a hidden chamber, but positioned openly, where it could be seen and approached, suggesting that its message was intended to be understood publicly, not only by priests or initiates, but by anyone who came into contact with the site. What is important to understand about Udayagiri is that these caves were not created in isolation from the world outside, because inscriptions link the site directly to Gupta rulers, indicating royal patronage and suggesting that this landscape functioned as a stage where divine order and political authority reinforced one another. In this context, the caves become more than religious spaces, transforming into instruments of legitimacy, where rulers align themselves with cosmic narratives of protection and renewal, embedding their authority directly into the rock of the land they governed. The choice to carve caves rather than construct freestanding temples is significant, because rock-cut architecture conveys stability and timelessness, qualities that rulers often wish to associate with their reigns, especially during periods of consolidation and expansion. The hill itself becomes part of the message, rising gently from the surrounding plain, anchoring power not in mobility or conquest, but in rootedness, as if to suggest that the order being established here was as enduring as the stone itself. Unlike earlier prehistoric sites where meaning must be inferred almost entirely from material remains, Udayagiri offers something closer to intention, because inscriptions, iconography, and placement work together to communicate ideas of kingship, cosmology, and moral order with unusual clarity. Yet even here, much remains understated, because the caves do not overwhelm with excess detail, and instead rely on carefully chosen symbols and limited spaces, allowing the environment to carry as much meaning as the carvings themselves. The experience of moving through Udayagiri would have been slow and deliberate, as visitors passed from open daylight into shaded interiors, transitioning from the natural world into spaces shaped by human belief, a movement that mirrors the broader shift from landscape to ideology. What distinguishes Udayagiri from later temple complexes is this balance between restraint and authority, where power is asserted not through scale alone but through placement, symbolism, and permanence, creating an atmosphere that feels controlled rather than imposing. There is also a notable absence of domestic life here, no evidence of bustling activity or daily routines, reinforcing the idea that this was a place meant for moments rather than lives, for ceremonies rather than communities. Over time, as political centers shifted and religious practices evolved, Udayagiri faded from prominence, not through destruction or conquest, but through quiet abandonment, leaving its carvings exposed to weather, light, and silence. Standing at the site today, one is aware that the caves were never meant to impress through novelty or mystery, but through certainty, because they communicate a worldview in which cosmic order, political authority, and the natural landscape were inseparable. Udayagiri does not ask questions in the way prehistoric sites often do, but instead presents answers that once felt self-evident to those who created them, reminding us that belief systems, when fully integrated into power and place, do not need explanation, only presence. And as the light moves across the rock face and the reliefs emerge and reseed with the passing hours, the caves continue to perform their original function, quietly asserting a vision of order carved directly into the land, long after the people who commissioned it have disappeared. Hattusa, The Green Stone. At the heart of the ancient Hittite capital of Hattusa, inside the ruins of what archaeologists identify as the Great Temple, there lies an object so visually unassuming and yet so persistently discussed that it has managed to outlive empires not through scale or grandeur, but through quiet ambiguity, a single block of smooth green stone placed deliberately within a sacred space where nothing appears accidental. Unlike walls, gates, or reliefs that dominate the landscape of Hattusa and immediately announce their function as fortifications or monuments, the green stone does not demand attention from afar because it is not large enough to impress through size and not ornate enough to explain itself through decoration. And yet, once noticed, it becomes difficult to ignore, precisely because it does not behave like an ordinary building material. The stone is rectangular, smoothly finished, and distinctly green in color, standing apart from the surrounding. Limestone blocks that make up most of the city's architecture, and this difference alone suggests intentional selection, because transporting a non-local stone into the center of a major temple complex would have required effort, planning, and a reason considered important enough to justify it. Hattusa itself was a city built around order, ritual, and administration, serving as the political and religious center of the Hittite Empire during the 2nd millennium BCE. And the Great Temple was not a casual place within that system, but one of the most controlled and symbolically charged spaces in the city, where festivals, offerings, and state rituals were carefully organized according to tradition and authority. Within such a setting, the presence of the green stone raises immediate questions, because sacred architecture in Hittite culture was structured, codified, and rarely improvised, meaning that any object placed within the temple precinct would have carried recognized meaning, even if that meaning no longer survives in written form. Scholars have proposed various explanations for the stone, ranging from a cult object associated with fertility or renewal, to a symbolic marker connected to treaties, oaths, or divine authority, and while none of these interpretations can be confirmed definitively, they all share a common assumption that the stone was meant to be interacted with, not merely observed. Its smooth surface suggests repeated contact, whether through touch, libation, or ritual handling, implying that the stone functioned as a focal point during ceremonies, perhaps serving as a physical anchor for actions meant to connect the human and divine realms. The choice of green stone itself may not have been arbitrary, because in many ancient cultures, green was associated with life, growth, and continuity, qualities that align closely with religious concerns about renewal, legitimacy, and the stability of cosmic order, particularly in a state that relied heavily on ritual to maintain favor with its gods. What complicates interpretation is that Hittite texts, while extensive, do not clearly describe an object that matches the green stone with certainty, leaving a gap between material evidence and written records that invites speculation while resisting simple conclusions. This gap has allowed modern imaginations to attach extraordinary explanations to the stone. But when viewed within the broader context of Hattusa, a city dense with ritual spaces, processional routes, and symbolic architecture, the green stone appears less like an anomaly and more like a quiet component of a larger ceremonial system that no longer functions as it once did. It is also worth noting that the stone's placement within the Great Temple situates it at the intersection of political power and religious practice, because Hittite kings were deeply involved in ritual life, acting not only as rulers but as participants in ceremonies that affirmed their legitimacy and reinforced their relationship with the divine. In this sense, the green stone may have served as a stabilizing presence, something constant within a city that experienced cycles of expansion, conflict, and reconstruction, offering continuity in a world where alliances shifted and borders changed. The fact that the stone remains in situ today, while much of the surrounding architecture lies fragmented, adds to its quiet authority, as if it fulfilled its role simply by remaining, by holding its position through time rather than asserting meaning through explanation. Standing before it now, the stone does not tell a story in the way reliefs or inscriptions do, but instead invites stillness, encouraging observation rather than interpretation, and reminding us that some sacred objects were designed to be experienced repeatedly rather than understood intellectually. the green stone of Hattusa resists categorization, not because it is mysterious by nature, but because it belongs to a ritual language that depended on action, memory, and shared understanding rather than written description. A language that dissolves when the culture that spoke it disappears. Rather than viewing this as a failure of archaeology, it may be more accurate to see it as evidence of how deeply ritual can be embedded in everyday space, becoming so familiar to its original users that it no longer required explanation, even as it becomes opaque to those who encounter it centuries later. In the end, the green stone remains what it has always been, a deliberately placed object in a deliberately sacred space, carrying meaning that once felt obvious and now feels distant, reminding us that not all power announces itself loudly, and that some symbols endure precisely because they never explain themselves at all. Great Zimbabwe, the walls without mortar. The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe rise from the landscape with a kind of quiet certainty that does not rely on height alone, because what immediately stands out is not how tall they are, but how deliberately they were built, each granite block carefully shaped and placed without mortar, forming long curving walls that feel more grown than constructed, as if the architecture followed rules understood instinctively rather than written down. Great Zimbabwe occupies a wide area of rolling terrain in southeastern Africa, and unlike many ancient cities that press tightly inward behind their defenses, this place spreads outward, with stone structures arranged across hills and valleys, suggesting a city that was confident in its position rather than anxious about attack. The most famous of these structures, the Great Enclosure, is defined by massive dry stone walls that curve inward and outward with subtle precision, creating enclosed spaces that feel controlled but not confined. And this curvature is important because it reveals that the builders were not stacking stone simply to block movement, but shaping space intentionally, guiding how people entered, moved through, and experienced the interior. Constructing walls of this scale without mortar requires an intimate understanding of stone, weight distribution, and balance, because every block must rest securely on those beneath it, and any mistake risks collapse, which means the builders of Great Zimbabwe possessed not only technical skill, but a long tradition of stoneworking knowledge refined over generations. These walls were built between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries CE, during a period when Great Zimbabwe functioned as the center of a powerful trading network, connected to the Indian Ocean world through routes that carried gold, ivory, and other resources outward, and brought foreign goods inward, tying this inland city to distant coasts and cultures. What is striking is that the walls themselves show little evidence of direct military function because they lack battlements, arrow slits, or obvious defensive features, and instead seem designed to mark boundaries, create hierarchy, and organize space within the city rather than repel invaders. Inside the Great Enclosure and other walled areas, the spaces feel ceremonial and controlled, suggesting that access was regulated, not violently but socially, with walls acting as instruments of order that reflected status, authority, and separation rather than fear. This interpretation is reinforced by the absence of destruction layers or signs of siege, indicating that the walls were not built in response to constant warfare, but as part of a stable and prosperous society that expressed power through architecture rather than conflict. The hilltop complex above the enclosure adds another layer of meaning, because elevated stone structures often served as centers of ritual or leadership, places where authority was both physically and symbolically raised above the surrounding community, reinforcing social hierarchy without the need for explicit enforcement. The builders of Great Zimbabwe left no written records to explain their intentions, but the consistency of construction techniques across the site suggests shared standards and centralized organization, pointing to a society capable of coordinating large labor forces and sustaining long-term projects. For centuries, outside observers struggled to accept that these walls were built by local African societies, revealing more about modern assumptions than ancient realities, because the architecture itself demonstrates clearly that the knowledge, skill, and organization required were present and thriving in this region long before external contact. Walking along the walls today, one becomes aware of how sound, light, and movement are shaped by the stone, how narrow passages slow the pace and open. Courtyards encourage gathering, indicating that these structures were designed to influence behavior as much as protect space. The dry stone technique also allowed for subtle flexibility, enabling walls to settle and adjust over time without catastrophic failure, a feature well suited to the local environment and one that speaks to practical experience rather than theoretical design. Great Zimbabwe's eventual decline appears to have been gradual rather than sudden, possibly linked to environmental pressures, shifts in trade routes, or resource depletion. And as the city's population moved on, the walls remained, holding their form long after their social function faded. What endures most strongly is not the mystery of who built Great Zimbabwe, but the clarity with which the walls communicate intention, control, and confidence, showing that monumental architecture does not always rely on conquest or domination, but can emerge from prosperity, organization, and shared belief. These walls were not meant to be temporary, and they were not meant to explain themselves, because their meaning was embedded in daily life, understood by those who passed through their gates and lived within their curves, even if that understanding no longer survives. In the end, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe stand as reminders that power can be expressed quietly, through balance rather than force, and that some of the most enduring monuments in human history are those built not to impress outsiders, but to structure the lives of those who belonged within them. Kaimanawa Wall. The structure known as the Kaimanawa Wall sits quietly within the forests of New Zealand's North Island, partially obscured by vegetation and shadow, and at first glance it does not appear dramatic or monumental, yet the longer one looks at it, the harder it becomes to dismiss, because the stones are arranged in a way that feels deliberate, ordered, and strangely out of place in a landscape shaped primarily by volcanic forces. The wall is composed of large stone blocks fitted together in straight horizontal and vertical lines, creating joints that resemble masonry rather than natural fracture. And it is this apparent regularity that has drawn attention, because nature rarely produces right angles repeatedly in such a confined area without some guiding process. Located in the Kaimanawa Range near Lake Taupo, the wall exists in a region defined by volcanic activity, seismic movement, and erosion, which immediately complicates interpretation because volcanic stone can fracture in geometric ways, and over long periods, erosion can exaggerate patterns that appear artificial to the human eye. Geologists have argued that the Kaimanawa Wall is a natural formation, the result of cooling and cracking in ignimbrite, a volcanic rock that can break along planes that mimic human construction. And according to this explanation, the apparent blocks are simply the exposed face of a larger geological feature shaped by time rather than tools. Yet this explanation has not fully resolved the debate, because the wall's exposed section appears unusually flat, with stones of similar height aligned in a consistent pattern, and the visible face suggests shaping rather than randomness, which has led others to question whether geology alone can account for what is seen. What makes the discussion particularly sensitive is New Zealand's human history, because mainstream archaeology holds that the islands were settled by Polynesian ancestors of the Maori, relatively late, around the 13th century CE, and the presence of a clearly man-made stone structure predating this would challenge established timelines. As a result, interpretations of the Kaimanawa Wall have often been shaped as much by cultural and political concerns as by scientific evidence, because acknowledging the possibility of an earlier construction would raise difficult questions about who built it, why they left no other clear traces, and how their presence fits into the broader story of the region. Despite periodic calls for extensive excavation, the wall has never been fully uncovered or systematically studied at depth, leaving much of the debate suspended between surface observation and theoretical explanation, and allowing uncertainty to persist longer than it might in less contested contexts. From a purely observational perspective, the wall's most striking quality is its stillness, because it does not dominate the landscape or draw attention to itself intentionally, but instead feels embedded, as though it has always been there, waiting to be noticed rather than announcing its presence. This quiet ambiguity has allowed the Kaimanawa Wall to become a projection point for wider questions about how history is constructed, which possibilities are explored, and which are dismissed, not always based on evidence alone, but on how disruptive certain answers might be. At the same time, caution is necessary because human perception is deeply attuned to patterns, and the temptation to see intention where none exists is strong, particularly when stones align in ways that resemble architecture familiar from other cultures and periods. What remains clear is that the wall occupies an uncomfortable space between geology and archaeology, where definitive answers are difficult to reach without invasive study, and where restraint has often been chosen over resolution. Standing before the stones, one becomes aware that certainty is not always the goal of historical inquiry, and that some sites remain valuable precisely because they resist classification, forcing us to confront the limits of what can be known from surface evidence alone. Whether the Kaimanawa Wall is the result of natural processes or human effort, its significance lies in the questions it provokes, because it challenges observers to think carefully about evidence, bias, and the assumptions brought to ancient landscapes. Rather than offering a clear narrative, the wall sits silently within the forest, unchanged by debate, unaffected by interpretation, and indifferent to the stories imposed upon it, reminding us that the past does not always resolve itself neatly, and that ambiguity is sometimes the most honest conclusion. In this sense, the Kaimanawa Wall becomes less about proving a forgotten civilization and more about understanding how knowledge is shaped, constrained, and occasionally left deliberately incomplete. And so the stones remain where they are, neither fully explained nor fully ignored, holding their position in the landscape as they have for centuries, allowing time, weather, and human curiosity to pass over them without offering a final answer. Takalik Abaj. Takalik Abaj occupies a gentle rise along the Pacific coastal foothills of what is now Guatemala, a location that does not overwhelm through elevation or monumentality, yet reveals its importance through continuity, because this is a place that was used, reshaped, and reinterpreted for centuries, quietly absorbing cultural change rather than resisting it. What makes Takalik Abaj unusual is not a single structure or dramatic ruin, but the fact that it sits at a crossroads of civilizations, preserving material evidence from both the Olmec and the early Maya worlds, making it one of the clearest physical records of cultural transition in ancient Mesoamerica. The earliest activity at the site dates back to the Middle Pre-Classic period, when Olmec influence extended far beyond its core regions. And at Takalik Abaj, this influence appears not as imitation, but as integration, with sculptural styles, symbols, and spatial organization blending into local traditions, rather than replacing them. Stone monuments at the site include carved stelae and altars that reflect Olmec iconography, such as stylized faces and motifs associated with authority and cosmology. Yet over time, these elements begin to shift, gradually adopting forms and arrangements more closely associated with emerging Maya traditions. This gradual change is important because it suggests continuity rather than disruption, a process in which ideas evolved organically through contact, trade, and shared ritual practices, rather than through conquest or sudden cultural replacement. Takalik Abaj was not isolated, and its location along key trade routes allowed it to function as a conduit for goods, ideas, and belief systems moving between the Pacific coast and the highlands, reinforcing its role as a place where influence flowed rather than settled. The architecture of the site reflects this long-term use, with platforms and structures built, modified, and rebuilt across generations, creating layers of construction that mirror the layers of cultural identity embedded in the site itself. Rather than monumental pyramids dominating the skyline, Takalik Abaj is defined by its ground-level engagement, with sculptures placed along pathways and near platforms, suggesting that ritual and authority were experienced through movement and proximity rather than distance. Many of the stone monuments were deliberately repositioned over time, sometimes buried or reoriented, indicating that later inhabitants were not merely inheriting the site passively, but actively reinterpreting its symbols to align with evolving belief systems. This practice of reworking earlier monuments suggests respect rather than rejection, an acknowledgement of ancestral authority even as new meanings were assigned, reflecting a worldview in which the past was not erased but absorbed. Water also played a significant role at Takalik Abaj, with early hydraulic features hinting at ritual and practical concerns, intertwined, reinforcing the idea that control of natural forces was central to social and religious life. Unlike later Maya cities where inscriptions clearly name rulers and dates, Takalik Abaj remains largely anonymous in historical terms, its power expressed through continuity and presence rather than explicit records, which may reflect an earlier stage of political organization. The absence of sharp breaks in occupation indicates that Takalik Abaj maintained its relevance across shifting cultural landscapes, adapting rather than collapsing as dominant traditions evolved around it. Standing among the monuments today, one becomes aware that the site does not belong fully to any single civilization. And this ambiguity is precisely what gives it significance, because it preserves the moment when identities were still forming, when boundaries between cultures were fluid rather than fixed. Takalik Abaj challenges the tendency to divide ancient history into neat categories, reminding us that civilizations rarely emerge fully formed, and that cultural change is often slow, layered, and collaborative. Rather than presenting a single narrative, the site offers a process, one that unfolds gradually through stone, space, and reuse, allowing us to observe transformation rather than simply its outcome. In this way, Takalik Abaj stands as evidence that some of the most important developments in human history occur not through dramatic events, but through sustained interaction, where ideas blend, adapt, and persist across generations. The stones here do not declare allegiance to one world or another, but instead quietly record the movement between them, preserving a transitional landscape where identity was negotiated rather than imposed. And as with many ancient sites that resist simple classification, Takalik Abaj reminds us that the past is often less about origins and endings, and more about the long, patient spaces in between. Gonur Tepe. Gonur Tepe lies deep within the desert landscapes of modern Turkmenistan, far from rivers that still flow and cities that still live, and at first glance it appears isolated and improbable. Yet this isolation is deceptive, because during the Bronze Age, this region formed the heart of a complex and interconnected cultural world that thrived not in spite of its environment, but by understanding it. The settlement belongs to what archaeologists call the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, often shortened to BMAC, a civilization that flourished roughly between 2300 and 1700 BCE, and whose cities reveal a level of organization, ritual life, and architectural planning that was once entirely unexpected in this part of Central Asia. Gonur Tepe itself was not a small outpost or temporary camp, but a large planned settlement with fortified walls, internal compounds, and clearly defined ceremonial spaces, indicating that it functioned as both an administrative and religious center within the wider region. What immediately stands out is the presence of monumental architecture built from mud brick, arranged in rectilinear forms that suggest careful planning and standardized construction methods, a sign that authority here was centralized and sustained over long periods rather than emerging sporadically. Among the most discussed features of Gonur Tepe are its ritual complexes, which include altars, hearths, and enclosed spaces interpreted as temples, where fire appears to have played a central role, hinting at belief systems that emphasized purification, transformation, and cosmic order. These ritual spaces were not isolated from daily life, but integrated into the settlement's core, suggesting that religious practice was not separate from governance or community organization, but intertwined with them, shaping how space was used and understood. Water management was equally important, because Gonur Tepe relied on an intricate system of canals to bring water from distant sources into the settlement, allowing agriculture and urban life to exist in a landscape that otherwise offered little support, and demonstrating advanced knowledge of hydraulic engineering. The careful control of water, combined with strong fortifications, implies a society that was both confident and cautious, aware of its vulnerability while actively working to mitigate it through planning rather than expansion. Material finds at Gonur Tepe include seals, ceramics, metal objects, and evidence of long-distance trade, linking the site to regions as far away as the Iranian Plateau, the Indus Valley, and Mesopotamia, reinforcing the idea that this was not a marginal culture, but an active participant in Bronze Age exchange networks. Despite these connections, Gunnar Tepe maintained a distinct identity, visible in its architectural styles and ritual practices, suggesting that cultural exchange did not dilute local traditions, but coexisted alongside them. One of the most intriguing aspects of Gunnar Tepe is the apparent emphasis on ritual continuity, because structures were rebuilt repeatedly on the same footprints, preserving spatial relationships over generations, which implies a strong sense of tradition and memory. This persistence contrasts with the eventual abandonment of the site, which appears to have occurred gradually rather than violently, possibly due to environmental changes, shifts in trade routes, or broader regional transformations that reduced the viability of desert-based urban centers. The absence of widespread destruction or abrupt collapse suggests that Gunnar Tepe's decline was not the result of conquest, but of adaptation, as populations reorganized and moved in response to changing conditions. Standing amid the ruins today, one is struck by the balance Gunnar Tepe once achieved between control and vulnerability, between ritual and practicality, and between isolation and connectivity, a balance that allowed it to flourish for centuries in an environment that remains challenging even now. What Gunnar Tepe ultimately reveals is that early urbanism was not confined to river valleys or fertile plains, but could emerge wherever knowledge, organization, and shared belief aligned to overcome environmental limits. Rather than representing a forgotten anomaly, the site stands as evidence of a broader Bronze Age world that was diverse, interconnected, and capable of sustaining complexity in unexpected places. The silence of Gunnar Tepe today does not signal failure, but completion, the end of a chapter in human experimentation with urban life that succeeded long enough to leave a clear imprint on the landscape. And as with many ancient centers that thrive beyond the margins of written history, Gunnar Tepe reminds us that the foundations of civilization were laid in many places at once, shaped by local conditions, shared ideas, and the quiet persistence of human effort. Banduria. Banduria lies near the modern city of Huacho on Peru's central coast, a landscape shaped by desert winds and seasonal rivers, where life has always depended on careful timing and collective effort. And it is within this narrow balance that one of the earliest monumental traditions in the Americas quietly emerged. The site belongs to the Norte Chico cultural sphere, one of the oldest known complex societies in the world, dating back more than 4,000 years. And what makes Banduria particularly striking is that its large platform mounds were constructed long before pottery, metallurgy, or written language became common, challenging assumptions about how and when organized societies take shape. Rather than relying on monumental stone architecture, Banduria's builders shaped the land itself, raising large earthen and stone platforms that dominated the surrounding terrain, creating elevated spaces that were visible from a distance and clearly distinct from domestic areas. These platforms were not built in isolation, but as part of an integrated complex, arranged in deliberate patterns that suggest planning, coordination, and shared purpose, all achieved without the technologies often assumed necessary for such large-scale construction. Archaeological evidence indicates that these structures were constructed and used over long periods, with repeated building phases that point to continuity rather than sudden ambition, suggesting that Banduria developed gradually through sustained communal investment. The absence of fortifications or weapons at the site is notable, because it implies that social organization here was not centered on conflict, but on cooperation, with collective labor directed toward building and maintaining shared, ceremonial or administrative spaces. This cooperative model is reinforced by the coastal environment, where access to marine resources could support large populations, allowing communities to invest energy in construction rather than subsistence alone, linking economic stability to architectural expression. The function of Banduria's platforms remains a subject of study, but their scale and layout suggest they served as gathering spaces for ritual, decision-making, or coordination of labor, places where social cohesion was reinforced through shared experience rather than enforced hierarchy. Unlike later Andean civilizations that emphasized stone masonry and imperial expansion, Banduria reflects an earlier stage of complexity, where monumentality emerged without clear signs of centralized rule or overt displays of power. The platforms themselves were built using simple materials, yet their size and precision indicate an understanding of engineering principles, including load distribution and long-term stability, achieved through experimentation and collective knowledge. What is particularly revealing is that Banduria appears to have been part of a network of contemporaneous sites along the coast, suggesting that its builders were connected to broader cultural traditions that valued monumentality as a means of social integration rather than domination. As environmental conditions changed and cultural practices evolved, Banduria's role diminished, and the site was eventually abandoned, not through destruction, but through a gradual shift in settlement patterns and priorities. Standing among the remains today, the platforms feel restrained rather than imposing, their significance lying not in decoration or scale alone, but in what they represent, an early experiment in organizing people, space, and labor toward shared goals. Banduria challenges the idea that complex societies require strong rulers or advanced technology to emerge, showing instead that cooperation, environmental knowledge, and long-term planning can produce monumentality even in the absence of centralized power. The site's quiet persistence over centuries suggests that its value lay in continuity, in the repeated act of coming together, building and maintaining spaces that mattered to the community as a whole. In this way, Banduria offers a glimpse into a formative moment in human history, when people began to express collective identity through architecture, shaping the land not to dominate it, but to bring themselves together within it. And as with many early centers of complexity, Banduria reminds us that the roots of civilization are often found not in conquest or hierarchy, but in cooperation, patience, and the shared willingness to build something that lasts beyond individual lives. Mustang Sky Caves. High in the trans-Himalayan landscape of northern Nepal, where the air thins and the terrain hardens into steep cliffs and dry valleys, the Mustang Sky Caves appear not as ruins scattered across the ground, but as openings carved directly into vertical rock faces, suspended far above the valley floor in places where access seems deliberately difficult rather than accidental. These caves are spread across the upper Mustang region, particularly around areas like Choser, and their placement alone forces an immediate reconsideration of how ancient people interacted with extreme environments, because carving living or ritual spaces into sheer cliffs requires not only technical skill, but a willingness to operate in spaces where a single mistake could be fatal. What is most striking is not the number of caves, which runs into the thousands, but their elevation, because many are located dozens of meters above the ground, far beyond easy reach, suggesting that safety. Isolation or control over access was a primary concern rather than convenience. Archaeological evidence indicates that the caves were used across multiple periods, beginning as early as the first millennium BCE and continuing through later centuries, with functions that appear to have shifted over time rather than remaining fixed, reflecting changing social and cultural needs. Some caves contain human remains, indicating funerary use, while others preserve traces of habitation, storage, or ritual activity, suggesting that the cliff faces themselves became multi-purpose landscapes where life, death, and belief were embedded directly into stone. The effort required to carve these caves into hard rock using limited tools implies long-term planning and collective labor, because such work could not have been accomplished quickly or casually, especially in an environment where resources were scarce and survival demanded constant attention. Access to the caves would have required ropes, ladders, or scaffolding, technologies that leave little permanent trace, yet their repeated use over generations suggests a shared understanding of risk and technique, passed down through experience rather than formal instruction. The choice to build upward rather than outward may have been influenced by several factors, including defense, because elevated dwellings are harder to reach, environmental pressures, such as limited arable land, and spiritual considerations, as high places are often associated with proximity to the sacred in Himalayan cultures. Over time, the caves became repositories of cultural memory, preserving manuscripts, murals, and artifacts that reflect the region's later Buddhist traditions, particularly during periods when Mustang functioned as a key corridor between the Tibetan Plateau and the lower Himalayan regions. These painted caves, hidden within cliffs, suggest a deliberate desire to protect knowledge and ritual from exposure, embedding spiritual practice into the landscape itself in a way that mirrors the physical isolation of the region. What is notable is that despite their dramatic appearance, the caves do not suggest a society driven by spectacle, because they are largely invisible from a distance and reveal themselves only upon close inspection, implying that their builders were more concerned with function, continuity, and protection than with display. The Mustang Sky caves also challenge assumptions about technological limitation, because while the builders lacked metal tools or advanced machinery in their earliest phases, they compensated through ingenuity, persistence, and intimate knowledge of stone. The gradual abandonment of many caves appears to have followed shifts in settlement patterns, trade routes, and political organization, as communities moved toward valley floors and built more accessible structures, leaving the cliff dwellings to weather and silence. Yet the caves were never erased from memory, continuing to hold symbolic significance and occasionally being reused or visited, maintaining a quiet presence above the landscape long after their original purposes faded. Standing below the cliffs today, the caves appear less like individual dwellings and more like a system, a vertical extension of human space that redefines what habitation can mean in extreme environments. Rather than representing isolation alone, the Mustang Sky caves reveal adaptation, showing how communities reshaped their surroundings to meet social, environmental, and spiritual needs without attempting to dominate the landscape outright. They remind us that human ingenuity often expresses itself most clearly at the margins, where survival depends not on abundance, but on understanding, cooperation, and restraint. And as the wind moves across the valley and shadows shift along the cliff faces, the caves remain where they were carved, silent witnesses to centuries of life lived upward rather than outward, preserving a chapter of human history written not on the land, but into it. Jibel Chaltun. Jibel Chaltun spreads quietly across the flat limestone plain of northern Yucatan, a landscape that offers no rivers, no hills, and very little visual drama. And yet it was here, in this seemingly limited environment, that one of the longest occupied Maya cities developed, sustained not by spectacle or conquest, but by careful adaptation to land that gives little and demands understanding in return. The city's name, which refers to the place where there is writing on stones, hints at a long and layered history, because Jibel Chaltun was not a single moment of construction, but a settlement that grew gradually over nearly 2,000 years, absorbing change rather than resisting it, and preserving continuity even as political centers rose and fell elsewhere in the Maya world. What immediately distinguishes Jibel Chaltun is its openness, because unlike the dense, towering architecture of southern lowland cities, this site unfolds horizontally with structures spread wide across the plain and connected by long, straight sakbiab, or raised white roads, that organized movement and linked ceremonial, residential, and administrative spaces into a coherent whole. These roads were not built for convenience alone, because in a landscape where direction can easily dissolve into sameness, straight lines carry meaning, imposing order and intention onto an otherwise uniform environment, and allowing the city to function as a navigable system rather than a clustered maze. Water, once again, defines everything, because Jibel Chaltun had no surface rivers and relied instead on cenotes, natural sinkholes that provided access to groundwater, and among them, the cenote Ixlaca served as both a practical resource and a focal point for ritual activity. The integration of this cenote into the urban fabric suggests that water was not treated as a hidden utility, but as a central element of civic and spiritual life, reinforcing the idea that survival and belief were inseparable in Maya planning. The most recognizable structure at Jibel Chaltun is the Temple of the Seven Dolls, a relatively modest building by Maya standards, yet one whose placement and alignment reveal careful astronomical consideration, because during the equinoxes the rising sun aligns precisely with the temple's central doorway, creating a moment of illumination that transforms the structure into a frame for celestial movement. This alignment was not decorative or incidental, but functional, serving as a visual marker for seasonal change, agricultural timing, and ritual observance, and reminding us that Maya architecture often operated as an instrument rather than a monument. What is striking is that this astronomical precision exists within a city that otherwise avoids excess, suggesting that knowledge, rather than scale, was the primary expression of authority here. Jibil Chaltun's long occupation meant that its population experienced shifts in political influence, trade networks, and religious practice. Yet the city endured, maintaining relevance through flexibility rather than dominance, which may explain why it lacks the dramatic collapse seen at other Maya centers. The absence of massive pyramids or carved monuments celebrating rulers suggests a social structure that emphasized continuity and communal order over individual glorification, a pattern consistent with the city's sustained stability. Artifacts recovered from the site indicate participation in long-distance trade, including connections to coastal and inland regions, reinforcing the idea that Zibil Chaltun functioned as a hub of exchange and movement rather than an isolated settlement. As centuries passed and regional dynamics shifted, the city slowly declined, not through destruction, but through gradual dispersal, as populations moved and priorities changed, leaving behind an urban framework that remained largely intact. Walking through Jibil Chaltun today, the experience is not one of awe through scale, but of clarity, because the city reveals itself through layout, alignment, and restraint, offering insight into how order was maintained over long periods without constant expansion or conflict. The stones here do not tell stories of conquest or collapse, but of persistence, of people who learned how to live within environmental limits while still creating a city that functions socially, economically, and spiritually. Zibil Chaltun reminds us that complexity does not always announce itself loudly, and that some of the most enduring urban traditions are those built quietly, through repetition, knowledge, and adaptation rather than spectacle. In the end, the city stands as an example of how human settlements can endure not by overwhelming their surroundings, but by understanding them, embedding meaning into movement, light, and water, and allowing architecture to serve life rather than dominate it. And as the sun continues to rise through the temple doorway each year, tracing the same path it has followed for centuries, Zibil Chaltun remains where it has always been, grounded in a landscape that rewards patience, precision, and balance. Pantalica. The necropolis of Pantalica is carved into the steep limestone cliffs of southeastern Sicily, overlooking the valleys of the Anapo and Calcinera rivers. And what first becomes apparent is not the scale of any single monument, but the overwhelming number of tombs, thousands of small openings puncturing the rock face, transforming the landscape itself into a record of collective memory. Unlike burial grounds laid out on flat land or marked by visible monuments, Pantalica's tombs are integrated directly into the cliffs, requiring deliberate effort to carve each chamber into hard stone, a task repeated over generations until the cliffs became a continuous field of burial spaces rather than a natural formation. These tombs date primarily to the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, a period when Sicily was home to communities navigating contact, trade, and cultural exchange across the Mediterranean. And Pantalica reflects this complexity not through artifacts alone, but through the sheer commitment to a shared funerary tradition. Each tomb is modest in size, typically designed to hold multiple burials, suggesting that family or kin groups were interred together, reinforcing social bonds even in death, and emphasizing continuity rather than individual distinction. The choice to locate the necropolis high on cliff faces is significant, because it removed the dead from everyday activity while keeping them visibly present in the landscape, creating a constant reminder of ancestry and belonging without allowing burial spaces to interfere with daily life. Carving tombs at such heights would have required planning, skill, and coordinated labor, indicating that burial was not an afterthought, but a central social responsibility that justified considerable effort. Over time, as populations grew and generations passed, the necropolis expanded, with new tombs cut alongside older ones, layering memory into stone and creating a landscape where the living and the dead were permanently linked through geography. Artifacts recovered from the tombs, including pottery and personal items, reveal connections to broader Mediterranean traditions, suggesting that the communities of Pantalica were not isolated but actively engaged with regional exchange networks. Despite these connections, the funerary practices at Pantalica remain distinctive, reflecting local choices about how death was managed, remembered, and integrated into social life. The absence of monumental tomb markers or inscriptions suggests that identity here was expressed collectively rather than individually, with status and memory embedded in participation rather than display. As cultural and political centers shifted over time, Pantalica's role as a burial site diminished, and the necropolis was eventually abandoned, not through destruction, but through changing settlement patterns and beliefs. Centuries later, the site was reused and reinterpreted, with later communities, occupying nearby areas and leaving traces that reflect new social structures layered onto an ancient funerary landscape. Walking along the valley today, the tomb openings appear almost uniform, creating a visual rhythm that emphasizes repetition over uniqueness, and reinforcing the idea that what mattered here was belonging to a lineage rather than standing apart from it. The cliffs themselves become a kind of archive, preserving thousands of individual lives within a shared framework that resists narrative simplification. Pantalica does not tell us the names or stories of those buried within its chambers, but it tells us something equally important, that remembrance can be communal, and that societies can choose to honor the dead through collective effort rather than monumental display. In this way, the necropolis reflects a worldview in which continuity mattered more than distinction, and where memory was preserved not through singular monuments, but through sustained participation in a shared tradition. As the light shifts across the cliff faces and shadows settle into the carved openings, the tombs remain where they were cut, silent and unchanged, continuing to shape the landscape long after the communities that created them moved on. Pantalica stands as a reminder that some of the most enduring human constructions are not those built for the living, but those created for the dead, and that through these spaces, societies leave behind quiet records of how they understood life, loss, and belonging. Sardis, the terraces of a vanished capital. The ruins of Sardis lie at the edge of the Hermus Valley in western Anatolia, where the land rises gently toward the foothills of Mount Tmolus. And although much of the city now appears scattered and fragmentary, the terraced landscape reveals that this was once a place shaped carefully to project order, authority, and permanence across uneven ground. Sardis served as the capital of the ancient kingdom of Lydia, a power that flourished during the first millennium BCE. And the city's terraces were not decorative features, but structural solutions, transforming sloping terrain into layered platforms capable of supporting monumental buildings, administrative spaces, and ceremonial routes. These terraces created a vertical organization of space, lifting certain areas above others, and in doing so they embedded social hierarchy directly into the landscape, because elevation itself became a marker of importance, separating the domains of rulers, officials, and ritual from the everyday activity of the lower city. The construction of such terraces required extensive labor and engineering knowledge, including retaining walls, drainage systems, and careful stone placement, all designed to stabilize the hillside and prevent collapse, particularly during seasonal rains that could otherwise undermine the city's foundations. Unlike cities that expanded outward across flat plains, Sardis expanded upward, using its terrain as an asset rather than a limitation, and this approach allowed the city to create controlled sightlines, processional paths, and visual dominance over the surrounding valley. At the highest levels, near the Acropolis, the terraces supported structures associated with power and governance, reinforcing the impression that authority here was not hidden but elevated, meant to be seen and approached in deliberate stages rather than accessed freely. Lower terraces accommodated residential and commercial areas, integrating daily life into the same engineered landscape, yet maintaining clear separation between spaces of administration and those of routine activity. The terrace design also reflected Sardis's role as a crossroads of cultures, because the city absorbed influences from Anatolian, Greek, and later Persian traditions, adapting its architecture to changing political realities while preserving its core spatial logic. When Sardis fell under Persian control, the terraces remained, continuing to support new buildings and functions, demonstrating that the city's underlying structure was flexible enough to survive shifts in power without requiring complete reorganization. Over centuries, earthquakes, floods, and abandonment took their toll, causing walls to collapse and platforms to erode. Yet the terraced form persists, allowing modern observers to trace the city's original logic even in ruin. Walking through Sardis today, one moves gradually upward, experiencing the city as its inhabitants once did, through ascent rather than enclosure, with each level offering a different perspective on space and authority. What becomes clear is that Sardis was designed not merely to house a population, but to communicate stability and control, using stone and elevation to impose order on a landscape that would otherwise resist it. The terraces also suggest long-term investment, because shaping land on this scale only makes sense if permanence is expected, and this confidence reflects a society that believed in its continuity, even as history proved otherwise. As political centers shifted and Sardis declined, the terraces remained as the city's most enduring feature, silently marking where power once stood and how it was expressed through landscape rather than walls alone. Rather than overwhelming through sheer monumentality, Sardis relied on gradual elevation, guiding movement and perception subtly, allowing architecture to shape experience without dramatic excess. In this way, the terraces of Sardis reveal a city that understood how to translate authority into space, embedding governance, hierarchy, and identity into the very ground beneath its buildings. Today, the ruins do not announce their former glory loudly, but through alignment, elevation, and restraint, they still convey the careful planning that once made Sardis a capital worthy of its time. And as the valley stretches outward below the broken platforms, the terraces continue to hold their shape, preserving the outline of a city that once ruled through organization, foresight, and the quiet power of engineered land. Kalibangan, the fire altars. Kalibangan lies along the dry bed of the Gagar Hakra river system in present-day Rajasthan, a region that today appears harsh and arid. Yet during the height of the Indus Valley civilization supported settled communities whose lives were closely tied to seasonal water and careful environmental management. What distinguishes Kalibangan from other Harappan sites is the discovery of a series of fire altars, structures that suggest ritual practice embedded directly into the urban fabric, rather than confined to separate ceremonial precincts or monumental temples. These fire altars were found within domestic and communal contexts, indicating that ritual activity here was not distant or exclusive, but integrated into everyday life, shaping routines and social organization alongside agriculture and trade. The altars themselves consist of brick-lined platforms and pits, often arranged in rows, with evidence of repeated use, such as ash deposits and signs of burning, suggesting that fire was maintained and renewed rather than used sporadically. This emphasis on fire introduces an important dimension to our understanding of Harappan belief systems, because while the Indus Valley civilization left few overt religious monuments, the presence of standardized ritual features points to shared practices and symbolic frameworks. The regularity and repetition of these altars imply prescribed methods and communal agreement, reinforcing the idea that ritual here followed established norms rather than individual improvisation. Kalibangan's urban layout also reflects deliberate planning, with streets laid out in a grid and residential areas clearly defined, mirroring patterns seen at other Harappan centers. Yet the inclusion of ritual structures within this plan suggests a closer relationship between civic order and spiritual practice. Unlike later cultures where fire rituals are described extensively in texts, the Harappan world remains largely silent, leaving archaeologists to infer meaning from material remains alone, which makes the fire altars at Kalibangan particularly valuable as rare physical indicators of belief. Some scholars have proposed connections between these altars and later fire-centered traditions in South Asia, though such links remain speculative, and caution is necessary to avoid projecting later practices backward without sufficient evidence. What is clear is that fire held symbolic importance, likely associated with purification, transformation, or communal identity, concepts that resonate across many early societies and often serve to reinforce social cohesion. Kalibangan also reveals evidence of agricultural adaptation, including early plowed fields, suggesting that ritual and subsistence were closely linked, with fire perhaps playing a role in marking seasonal cycles or agricultural transitions. The city experienced phases of construction, damage, and rebuilding, including evidence of flooding and possible seismic activity, yet the ritual features persisted, indicating their importance within the community's priorities. Eventually, as environmental conditions shifted and the Gagarhakra system declined, Kalibangan was abandoned, not through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual relocation, as the balance between settlement and water availability became unsustainable. Today, the fire altars remain as quiet traces of a ritual life that once burned at the center of daily existence, offering rare insight into a civilization that expressed belief subtly, rather than through towering monuments. Kalibangan challenges the assumption that complex ritual systems require elaborate temples, showing instead that shared practices can be embedded directly into domestic space, shaping social life through repetition rather than spectacle. In this way, the site provides a more intimate view of Harappan spirituality, one that emphasizes continuity, community, and the disciplined maintenance of tradition over dramatic display. As the desert wind moves across the ruins and the outlines of brick platforms emerge from the soil, the fire altars of Kalibangan continue to suggest a world where ritual was not separated from life, but lived alongside it, day after day, season after season. Kerkuan. Kerkuan lies on the windswept coast of the Cap Bon Peninsula in northeastern Tunisia, facing the Mediterranean in a position that feels open rather than fortified. And this openness is the first clue to understanding the site, because Kerkuan was not built to dominate the sea through force, but to live alongside it through trade, routine, and continuity. The city was founded by the Punic world, closely associated with Carthaginian culture, yet unlike Carthage itself, Kerkuan was never rebuilt after its destruction, which means what survives today is not a layered palimpsest of centuries, but a rare, intact snapshot of a Punic coastal town frozen at a specific moment in time. This absence of later reconstruction is what makes Kerkuan extraordinary, because when the city was abandoned during the First Punic War in the 3rd century BCE, it was left largely untouched, preserving its streets, houses, and daily infrastructure in a way that is almost unique in the Mediterranean world. Walking through Kerkuan today, one does not encounter monumental temples or towering public buildings, but instead a carefully planned urban grid with narrow streets, modest homes, and shared spaces arranged with clear intention, suggesting a community organized around domestic life rather than imperial display. The houses themselves reveal much about Punic society, because many were equipped with private bathing facilities, complete with basins and drainage systems, indicating a strong cultural emphasis on cleanliness, routine, and personal space, long before such features became common elsewhere. These baths were not luxury additions, but standard elements of domestic architecture, implying that ideas of hygiene and comfort were widely shared rather than restricted to elites, and that daily life at Kerkuan followed established norms rather than improvisation. The city's layout reflects careful planning, with streets oriented to manage drainage and wind, adapting the urban fabric to the coastal environment rather than imposing rigid symmetry upon it. Evidence of purple dye production, derived from murex shells, points to Kerkuan's role in regional trade networks, because this dye was highly valued across the ancient Mediterranean, linking the town economically to distant markets despite its relatively small size. Unlike heavily fortified ports, Kerkuan's defenses were minimal, suggesting that its prosperity depended more on stability and exchange than on military strength, and that its inhabitants trusted in networks and agreements rather than walls alone. When Roman expansion reached the region, Kerkuan was destroyed and abandoned, and because the site was never resettled or rebuilt, its Punic character remained preserved beneath layers of sand and soil, untouched by Roman architectural norms that transformed so many other cities. This abrupt end, followed by long silence, allowed Kirkuane to survive, not as a ruin shaped by adaptation, but as a cultural time capsule, offering archaeologists direct insight into Punic urban life without the distortions of later occupation. Artifacts recovered from the site, including ceramics, tools, and everyday objects, reinforce the impression of a community focused on routine, trade, and domestic stability rather than monumental ambition. Kirkuane challenges the tendency to define ancient civilizations solely through their capitals and grand projects, showing instead how culture was lived at the local level through houses, streets, and repeated daily actions. The city's modest scale does not diminish its significance because it reveals how Punic identity was expressed consistently across regions, not only in political centers but in ordinary towns that sustained economic and social networks. Standing among the low walls and narrow passages today, one senses a city shaped by habit rather than spectacle, where meaning was embedded in repetition, and where continuity mattered more than display. Kirkuane does not speak of conquest or collapse in dramatic terms, but of interruption, a life paused rather than erased, leaving behind a clear imprint of how people organized space, time, and community along the ancient Mediterranean shore. In this way, the ruins offer something rare, not the story of how a city changed, but how it once was, preserved long enough for us to observe the quiet details that usually disappear first. And as the sea continues to break against the nearby coast, Kirkuane remains where it was left, a Punic city that never became Roman, holding its form as a reminder that sometimes history is preserved not by survival, but by abandonment. Gebel el-Silsila. Gebel el-Silsila stretches along a narrow bend of the Nile between Edfu and Kom Ombo, where the river constricts and sandstone cliffs rise close to the water, creating a landscape that feels controlled by nature itself. And it is precisely this narrowing that made the place significant long before its name was recorded, because here the Nile could be observed, accessed, and shaped more easily than almost anywhere else along its course. For much of ancient Egyptian history, Gebel el-Silsila was not a city, a temple complex, or a settlement in the conventional sense, but a working landscape, a place defined by extraction rather than habitation, where stone was removed from the earth in vast quantities and transformed into the architecture that defined Egyptian civilization. The sandstone quarried here was used to build temples, pylons, statues, and monuments across Upper Egypt, meaning that although Gebel el-Silsila itself remains relatively modest in appearance, its material presence extends far beyond its cliffs, embedded in sacred and ceremonial spaces hundreds of kilometers away. What makes the site remarkable is the scale and organization of its quarrying activity, because extraction here was not haphazard or temporary, but systematic, regulated, and sustained over centuries, reflecting state control, logistical planning, and a deep understanding of stone. Cut marks, unfinished blocks, and stepped quarry faces still line the cliffs, revealing the methods by which workers isolated massive sandstone blocks, using hand tools, wedges, and careful planning, shaping the rock face incrementally rather than violently. These marks transformed the cliffs into a record of labor, preserving gestures repeated countless times by workers whose names rarely appear in inscriptions, yet whose efforts formed the physical foundation of temples that still stand today. Gebel el-Silsila was also a place of ritual significance, not despite its industrial role, but because of it, as evidenced by the presence of rock-cut chapels, shrines, and inscriptions carved directly into the quarry walls, blending labor and devotion into a single landscape. Officials, priests, and workers left reliefs depicting offerings to gods associated with the Nile, fertility, and protection, suggesting that the act of quarrying itself required divine favor, and that extracting stone was understood as a sacred responsibility rather than a purely economic activity. The proximity of the Nile allowed stone blocks to be loaded directly onto boats, turning the river into a transportation corridor that connected Gebel el-Silsila to distant building sites, and reinforcing the idea that Egyptian monumental architecture was inseparable from the river that sustained it. This logistical efficiency meant that the site functioned as a critical node within a vast state-managed system, linking quarry workers, administrators, transport crews, and temple builders into a coordinated process that spanned regions and generations. Unlike cities that evolved organically, Gebel el-Silsila existed because it was needed, expanding and contracting according to construction demands, political priorities, and religious projects commissioned by different dynasties. During periods of intense building, the cliffs would have echoed with sound and activity, while during quieter times, the site would have returned to stillness, its importance defined not by population, but by readiness. The presence of royal inscriptions indicates that pharaohs took a direct interest in the site, acknowledging the strategic importance of controlling stone resources, and reinforcing the idea that power in ancient Egypt was expressed not only through finished monuments, but through command over the materials that made them possible. What is striking is that despite its industrial function, Gebel el-Silsila was not stripped of meaning, because the workers who labored here carved prayers, names, and symbols into the rock, asserting identity and belief within a system that often prioritized the eternal over the individual. Over time, as building priorities shifted and alternative sources of stone were used, quarrying at Gebel el-Silsila declined, leaving behind a landscape shaped by removal rather than accumulation, where absence itself became the defining feature. Standing at the site today, one is aware that the cliffs do not represent destruction, but transformation, because what was taken from this place did not vanish, but reappeared elsewhere in forms meant to last forever. Gebel el-Silsila challenges the way monumental history is often told, reminding us that temples and statues begin not in sacred precincts, but in working landscapes where labor, logistics, and belief intersect. Rather than being a peripheral site, it was central to the making of ancient Egypt, supplying the raw material from which divine order was constructed in stone. And as the Nile continues to move past the cliffs, carrying silt, water, and memory downstream, Gebel el-Silsila remains a quiet reminder that civilization is built not only by vision, but by extraction, coordination, and the patient reshaping of the earth itself. Monte Baranta. Monte Baranta returns us once again to a quiet plateau in northern Sardinia, not because it offers new monuments or fresh discoveries, but because it represents a kind of architectural thinking that becomes clearer only after seeing many other ancient places, when patterns begin to repeat and certain choices start to stand out as deliberate rather than accidental. Seen in isolation, Monte Baranta can appear incomplete, even confusing. A single massive wall, a few scattered structures, and a broad open space that resists easy classification. Yet when placed alongside other early sites that shaped land rather than filled it, the logic of the place begins to sharpen. The wall at Monte Baranta cuts across the plateau with confidence, wide and heavy, constructed from large limestone blocks laid without mortar, following the natural curve of the hill rather than imposing a rigid geometry upon it, suggesting that the builders were working with the landscape rather than attempting to dominate it. This cooperation with terrain is significant because it reflects a mindset in which architecture was meant to reinforce existing advantages, such as visibility and elevation, instead of creating artificial barriers where none were needed. From the plateau, the surrounding land unfolds in long, open views, allowing movement to be seen from great distances, and this visual control appears to be the true strength of the site, with the wall acting less as a final line of defense and more as a reinforcement of a position that was already strategically chosen. Unlike later fortresses that enclosed dense populations, Monte Baranta remains largely open, with little evidence of permanent habitation, implying that the site was activated only at certain times, perhaps during moments of gathering, tension, or seasonal importance. The labor required to construct the wall would have demanded coordination across a community, yet the absence of domestic clutter suggests that this effort was not directed toward daily life, but toward a collective purpose that extended beyond individual households. This separation between work and residence hints at a social structure capable of organizing people around shared projects without requiring centralized urban living, a pattern that appears in several early societies where monumentality emerges before cities. What Monte Baranta lacks in architectural complexity, it compensates for in clarity of intention, because the wall's placement, scale, and orientation all point toward control of space, rather than defense against overwhelming force. There are no towers, no elaborate gateways, no signs of sustained siege, reinforcing the idea that this was not a reaction to constant warfare, but a measured response to perceived need, whether that need was territorial, social, or symbolic. In this context, the wall can be understood as a boundary that communicated authority, marking where movement slowed, where access was considered, and where presence became noticeable, even without confrontation. Such boundaries are often invisible in prehistoric landscapes, enforced through tradition or memory, but Monte Baranta renders one visible, transforming social agreement into stone. The simplicity of the site may also reflect restraint, because building only what was necessary suggests a community that understood limits, both environmental and social, and avoided unnecessary expenditure of labor. Over time, as social structures changed and new forms of organization emerged elsewhere on the island, Monte Baranta's role diminished, not through destruction, but through irrelevance, as the wall continued to stand even when its function no longer applied. What remains today is not a ruin in the dramatic sense, but a presence, a line across the land that still alters how the plateau is experienced, guiding movement and perception in subtle ways. Monte Baranta does not offer inscriptions, myths, or monuments to explain itself, but instead relies on position, scale, and endurance, allowing interpretation to emerge slowly through comparison rather than revelation. In this way, the site reminds us that early architecture was often less about buildings and more about decisions, about where to draw lines, where to stand, and how to shape collective behavior through space. By returning to Monte Baranta after encountering cities, temples, quarries, and ritual landscapes across the ancient world, its restraint becomes its message, showing that power does not always announce itself loudly, and that some of the earliest architectural statements were made not through complexity, but through certainty. The wall still holds its place on the plateau, unchanged, not because it resists time, but because it was never meant to change, serving its purpose and then simply remaining, a quiet marker of intention carved into the Sardinian landscape. And as with many early sites that shaped land rather than filled it, Monte Baranta reminds us that the foundations of architecture lie not in decoration or density, but in the decision to intervene, once, decisively, and then step back. Dolmen de la Pastora. The Dolmen de la Pastora lies beneath gentle ground near the modern town of Valencina de la Concepcion in southern Spain. And at first, nothing in the landscape suggests what waits below, because this is not a monument that rises upward or announces itself from afar, but one that withdraws inward, asking to be entered slowly, deliberately, and with attention. This structure belongs to a vast prehistoric complex that once dominated the Guadalquivir region during the Copper Age, a time when communities were growing larger, more organized, and more capable of coordinating labor on a scale that went far beyond individual families, yet still lacked writing, centralized states, or permanent kingship as we understand it today. What distinguishes the Dolmen de la Pastora is its extraordinary corridor, a long, narrow passage extending more than 40 meters, carefully constructed from large stone slabs and gradually descending toward a circular burial chamber, creating a physical journey that feels intentional rather than practical. Unlike shorter passage tombs where movement is brief and direct, this corridor slows the body, limits vision, and compresses sound, forcing anyone who enters to move forward with awareness, as if the act of approach mattered as much as the destination itself. The walls of the corridor are built from upright stone slabs, some weighing several tons, placed with precision and then covered by earth to create a mound that sealed the structure from above, transforming freestanding stone into a hidden interior world. The chamber at the end is circular and enclosed, its form contrasting with the long linear approach, suggesting a transition from movement to stillness, from journey to arrival, and this contrast appears repeatedly in prehistoric funerary architecture across Europe. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Dolmen de la Pastora was used as a collective burial place, with human remains deposited over time, rather than all at once, implying that the tomb functioned as a long-term point of return rather than a single commemorative event. This repeated use suggests continuity, memory, and shared ancestry, because returning to the same place to bury the dead reinforces social bonds and affirms belonging to a lineage that extends backward and forward in time. What is particularly striking is the orientation of the corridor, which faces roughly west toward the setting sun, a choice that likely carried symbolic meaning, associating death with sunset, transition, and the movement from light into darkness, themes that recur in many prehistoric belief systems. The builders of the Dolmen de la Pastora invested enormous effort into shaping this underground space, not to create comfort or shelter, but to create experience, because nothing about the design is efficient in a practical sense, yet everything about it appears purposeful. Transporting the stone slabs required coordination, planning, and communal labor, suggesting that the construction of the tomb was itself a social act, one that brought people together long before the first burial took place. The decision to build such a long corridor underground reflects a sophisticated understanding of space and psychology, because narrowing passages, controlled light, and gradual descent all influence perception, emotion, and attention, even without formal ritual instruction. Within the broader Valencina complex, which includes multiple megalithic monuments, large enclosures, and evidence of craft production and trade, the Dolmen de la Pastora stands out as particularly inward-focused, concerned less with visibility and more with internal meaning. This inwardness suggests that not all expressions of power or belief were meant to be seen publicly, and that some of the most important social practices occurred away from daily life, hidden beneath the ground. The absence of elaborate decoration or carvings inside the tomb reinforces this idea, because meaning here was carried by form, orientation, and movement rather than imagery or narrative. As centuries passed and burial practices changed, the dolmen fell out of use, gradually sealed by time and sediment, preserving its interior in a state of suspended purpose, neither destroyed nor adapted, simply closed. Rediscovered much later, the tomb offered archaeologists a rare opportunity to observe prehistoric architectural intention almost intact, allowing insight into how space was used to structure ritual without reliance on text or iconography. What becomes clear when moving through the dolmen is that it was never meant for frequent or casual entry, because each visit would have required effort, preparation, and collective agreement, reinforcing the seriousness of the act. This controlled access suggests that burial was not merely disposal of the dead, but a carefully managed process, likely accompanied by spoken ritual, memory, and communal, presence that left little material trace. The Dolmen de la Pastora challenges modern assumptions that complexity requires visibility, because here complexity is hidden, embedded in sequence and experience rather than display. It also reminds us that early societies invested deeply in places that served no economic function, devoting time and energy to spaces meant solely to manage transition, loss, and continuity. In the broader story of prehistoric Europe, monuments like this mark a shift toward formalized ritual architecture, where belief is no longer expressed only through practice, but through permanent structures designed to outlast individual lives. Standing at the entrance today, one senses that the dolmen was never intended to impress through scale alone, but through depth, through the slow removal from the surface world and the equally slow return. This descent and ascent mirrors the cycle the builders may have imagined for life itself, moving from presence to absence, and back again through memory. The Dolmen de la Pastora does not tell us what its builders believed in words we can understand, but it shows us how they believed, through stone, darkness, orientation, and effort. It shows a society that understood that some experiences gain power precisely because they are difficult, restricted, and rare. And as the earth continues to rest above the corridor and chamber, unchanged by centuries of passing time, the dolmen remains what it has always been, not a monument to individuals, but a space for return, for repetition, and for the quiet reinforcement of collective identity. In this way, the Dolmen de la Pastora brings this long journey through ancient landscapes to a fitting pause, reminding us that before cities, before writing, and before history as we record it, people were already shaping space to give meaning to life, death, and everything that lies between. Lipensky Vir, the stone layouts. Lipensky Vir lies along a dramatic bend of the Danube River in the Iron Gates Gorge, where steep cliffs press close to the water and the river narrows, accelerates, and dominates the landscape, creating a setting where human life has always been shaped by movement, sound, and seasonal rhythm, rather than by open land or agricultural abundance. What makes Lipensky Vir remarkable is not its size or monumentality, but the precision of its layout, because here, during the Mesolithic period, long before farming societies spread across Europe, people organized their living space with a level of geometric consistency that feels deliberate, symbolic, and deeply tied to place. The settlement is defined by a series of trapezoidal stone house floors, carefully arranged in rows facing the river, each one aligned with the same orientation, creating a unified architectural language repeated again and again, suggesting shared rules rather than individual preference. These stone layouts were not foundations for towering structures, but complete living surfaces in themselves, built low to the ground and framed by stone borders, indicating that the floor, rather than the wall, was the primary architectural element around which domestic life was organized. The trapezoidal shape is significant because it mirrors the profile of the surrounding cliffs across the river, implying that the builders were intentionally echoing the natural forms of the landscape within their domestic space, blending habitation and environment into a single visual system. At the center of many of these stone floors lies a hearth, carefully positioned and consistently shaped, reinforcing the idea that fire, rather than enclosure, defined the heart of each dwelling, anchoring daily life through warmth, cooking, and social gathering. What stands out is the uniformity of these layouts across the site, because such consistency implies shared knowledge, tradition, and perhaps ritual obligation, rather than spontaneous or temporary occupation. Lipensky Vir was inhabited over several phases, during a time of transition when hunting and fishing communities were beginning to encounter agricultural groups moving into the region. Yet the stone layouts reflect continuity rather than disruption, suggesting that the inhabitants maintained their own identity even as external influences appeared. The Danube itself played a central role in shaping life here, providing abundant fish and acting as a corridor of movement and exchange. And the orientation of the houses toward the river reinforces the idea that this was not merely a resource, but a defining presence, shaping belief as much as subsistence. Within and around the houses, archaeologists discovered carved stone sculptures, often depicting stylized human faces with fish-like features, blurring the boundary between human and animal, and suggesting a worldview in which identity, survival, and environment were inseparable. These sculptures were not placed randomly, but positioned carefully within domestic spaces, indicating that ritual and daily life were intertwined, rather than separated into distinct sacred and profane zones. Unlike later Neolithic villages, where architecture often reflects agricultural cycles and storage needs, Lipensky Vir's stone layouts emphasize stability, orientation, and repetition, qualities that align more closely with ritual continuity than with economic expansion. The effort required to construct and maintain these stone floors suggests long-term commitment to place, because stone architecture is not easily abandoned or relocated, and choosing it implies an intention to remain rather than move seasonally. This permanence is striking for a society traditionally described as mobile, forcing a reconsideration of how Mesolithic communities organize space, memory, and belonging. Over time, as farming practices spread and social structures shifted, Lipensky Vir was gradually abandoned, not through sudden collapse, but through transformation, as new ways of life rendered the old patterns less practical. Yet, the stone layouts remained, preserving the logic of a settlement built around alignment rather than enclosure, orientation rather than defense, and continuity rather than growth. Standing at the site today, one senses that Lipinski Vir was not designed to expand indefinitely, but to repeat itself, each house echoing the next, reinforcing collective identity through form rather than hierarchy. The absence of walls separating dwellings suggests openness rather than isolation, a community defined by shared space and mutual visibility, where life unfolded collectively rather than privately. Lipinski Vir challenges linear narratives of progress because it shows that architectural planning, symbolic geometry, and ritual integration existed long before agriculture, cities, or writing. It reveals a moment in human history when people were not yet builders of monuments, but were already architects of meaning, shaping space to reflect their relationship with the river, the land, and each other. Rather than representing an early step toward later urbanism, Lipinski Vir stands as its own solution, finely tuned to its environment and moment in time. And as the Danube continues to flow past the cliffs, reshaping its banks and carrying memory downstream, the stone layouts of Lipinski Vir remain as quiet evidence that long before walls rose and cities formed, people were already organizing life with intention, geometry, and a deep awareness of where they stood in the world. Tinkinswood Burial Chamber. Tinkinswood sits quietly in the rolling countryside of South Wales, not on a dramatic peak or a commanding ridge, but in a landscape shaped by gentle slopes and long continuity. And this understated setting is important because it reflects the way this monument was meant to function, not as a landmark of dominance, but as a place of return. The structure dates to the Neolithic period, more than 5,000 years ago, when farming communities were beginning to establish permanent ties to land, and what they built at Tinkinswood was not a dwelling for the living, but a carefully constructed space for the dead, one that would remain relevant across generations rather than serve a single moment. The burial chamber itself is defined by massive upright stones supporting an enormous capstone, one of the largest in Britain, placed with such precision that it still rests securely today, a reminder that technical confidence existed long before metal tools or written plans. This capstone does not merely cover the chamber, but defines it, pressing downward visually and physically, creating a sense of enclosure that is both protective and final, and shaping the interior space into something distinct from the open world outside. Originally, the chamber was covered by a long earthen mound, now mostly eroded, which would have concealed the stone structure almost entirely, transforming it into an interior world accessed deliberately rather than encountered casually. Archaeological excavations revealed the remains of dozens of individuals within the chamber, deposited over an extended period, indicating that Tinkinswood functioned as a collective burial place, where the dead were gathered together rather than separated. This collective use suggests a worldview in which identity was communal rather than individual, and where belonging to a group mattered more than personal distinction, even in death. The chamber's design reinforces this idea because it offers no divisions, no separate spaces for different individuals, but instead a shared interior where remains were placed together, allowing memory to accumulate rather than isolate. The act of entering the chamber would have required effort, coordination, and intention, especially when the mound was intact, meaning that burial was not routine disposal, but a ritualized event that reaffirmed social bonds among the living. What is particularly striking is the durability of the structure, because building with stones of this size required careful selection, transport, and placement, all accomplished through communal labor and shared knowledge. The choice to invest such effort in a burial chamber suggests that maintaining connection with ancestors was a priority strong enough to justify long-term commitment of resources and energy. Unlike later monuments that emphasize alignment with celestial events, Tinkinswood appears more inward-focused, concerned less with the sky and more with continuity beneath the earth, reinforcing the sense that the chamber was meant to anchor memory to place. The absence of elaborate carvings or decoration further emphasizes this restraint, because meaning here was carried by form, mass, and repetition rather than imagery or narrative. Over time, as burial practices changed and communities reorganized, the chamber fell out of use. Yet the stones remained, continuing to define a space that no longer served its original function, but retained symbolic presence. Standing inside the chamber today, one is struck by the quiet weight of the stones, the way sound softens and light diminishes, creating an atmosphere that feels deliberately separate from the surrounding landscape. This separation may have been essential to the ritual experience, allowing those who entered to step briefly outside daily life and into a space shaped by memory, loss, and continuity. Tinkin's Wood does not tell us what words were spoken here, or what gestures accompanied burial, but it tells us that the act of remembering was formalized, structured, and embedded into architecture. It reminds us that some of the earliest permanent structures humans built were not for shelter or defense, but for managing relationships with the dead, and through them, with time itself. The chamber's endurance speaks to the success of this intention, because it continues to mark the landscape long after the social structures that created it have disappeared. Rather than overwhelming through scale alone, Tinkin's Wood asserts its presence through stability, a refusal to collapse or shift, reinforcing the idea that permanence was the message. In the broader context of Neolithic Britain, sites like Tinkin's Wood reveal a shared investment in collective memory, where burial chambers served as anchors for identity in a changing world. They show that before monuments celebrated rulers or gods, they commemorated continuity, binding communities, together through shared ancestry and repeated ritual. As grass grows around the stones and the landscape continues to change, the burial chamber remains where it was placed, fulfilling its purpose simply by enduring. And in that endurance, Tinkin's Wood offers a quiet conclusion to this chapter of ancient architecture, reminding us that long before history was written, people were already building places meant to outlast them, shaping stone not to speak loudly, but to remember. Healy Archaeological Park. Healy Archaeological Park lies within the oasis landscape of Al Ain, where groundwater rises just enough to sustain life in an otherwise arid environment. And this delicate balance between dryness and fertility is the key to understanding why people chose to settle here during the Bronze Age, transforming a fragile water source into the foundation of long-term community life. The site is best known for the Hilly Grand Tomb, a large circular stone structure dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, yet focusing on the tomb alone risks missing the broader significance of Hilly, because this was not a single monument placed in isolation, but part of a wider settlement system that included domestic structures, agricultural activity, and carefully managed water resources. The circular tomb is built from well-cut stone blocks arranged with precision, forming a low, solid ring that encloses a central burial chamber, and its form immediately communicates collective effort rather than individual commemoration, reinforcing the idea that social identity here was shared rather than personal. Carved reliefs on the tomb depict animals and human figures, offering rare glimpses into symbolic expression in a region where organic materials rarely survive, and suggesting that art, memory, and ritual were embedded directly into funerary architecture. The presence of multiple burials within the tomb indicates repeated use over time, transforming the structure into a focal point for ancestral memory and communal identity, rather than a one-time construction. Beyond the tomb, archaeological remains reveal traces of houses, workshops, and open spaces, indicating that Hilly supported a permanent or semi-permanent population that relied on oasis agriculture, animal husbandry, and regional exchange networks. One of the most important aspects of Hilly is its evidence for early water management, including irrigation channels that directed groundwater to cultivated areas, demonstrating that survival here depended on cooperation, planning, and shared responsibility. This reliance on controlled water access shaped social organization, because managing an oasis requires coordination rather than domination, reinforcing collective norms and discouraging excessive concentration of power. The layout of the settlement reflects this balance, with structures arranged to support daily life while remaining closely tied to agricultural activity, blurring the boundary between domestic and productive space. Healy's location placed it along trade routes connecting the interior of the Arabian Peninsula with coastal regions, allowing the community to participate in broader exchange networks while maintaining local stability. Artifacts recovered from the site, including pottery and tools, indicate contact with distant regions, suggesting that Hili was not isolated, but integrated into a wider Bronze Age world. Over time, environmental changes and shifting trade patterns altered the viability of oasis settlements, and Hili was eventually abandoned, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual relocation as resources and priorities shifted. What remains today is a landscape shaped by human adaptation rather than domination, where architecture reflects sensitivity to environment rather than attempts to overpower it. Walking through Hili Archaeological Park, one becomes aware that its monuments were not meant to impress through scale alone, but to endure through relevance, serving practical, ritual, and social functions simultaneously. The circular tomb stands not as a symbol of hierarchy, but as evidence of collective memory, anchoring community identity in a place where survival required cooperation. Hili challenges assumptions that complex social organization requires dense urban centers, showing instead that small, well-managed communities could sustain continuity in difficult environments through shared knowledge and effort. The site also reminds us that some of the earliest experiments in settled life occurred not in fertile river valleys, but in marginal landscapes where success depended on restraint and understanding. As the modern city of Al Ain grows around it, Hili remains preserved within a protected park, offering a rare window into a Bronze Age world that balanced human need with environmental limit. And as water continues to rise quietly beneath the oasis, sustaining life as it has for millennia, Hili stands as a testament to the power of adaptation, showing how ancient communities shaped their world not by force, but by cooperation, memory, and careful stewardship of the resources they depended upon. Loch Mariacher, Grand Manhir Bass. At Loch Mariacher, on the edge of the Morbihan coast in Brittany, what draws attention is not a standing monument, but the place where one once stood, a massive stone whose presence is now understood through its absence, because the Grand Menhir Brise no longer rises above the land, yet its broken base still anchors the landscape with unmistakable intent. The menhir that once stood here was extraordinary in scale, estimated to have reached more than 20 meters in height and weighing hundreds of tons, making it the largest known standing stone ever erected in prehistoric Europe. And the fact that such an object was raised at all forces us to confront the level of organization, planning, and collective will that existed long before metal tools or written records. What remains today are the base socket where the stone once stood and the enormous fragments scattered nearby, broken in antiquity, their surfaces weathered but unmistakably shaped, offering silent testimony to an achievement that does not need to be reconstructed visually to be understood as remarkable. The base itself is carefully prepared, cut into the bedrock to receive the stone securely, indicating that the builders understood not only how to move and raise massive objects, but how to anchor them so they could stand for generations. This preparation suggests that the menhir was not experimental or symbolic alone, but meant to endure, to occupy the landscape as a fixed reference point that shaped movement, visibility, and meaning across the surrounding terrain. Loch Mariacher was not an isolated monument, but part of a dense megalithic landscape that included passage tombs, stone alignments, and other standing stones, indicating that this coast was a major ceremonial and social center during the Neolithic period. The placement of the Grand Menhir near the shoreline suggests a connection between land and sea, because this is a place where tides, horizons, and routes converge, and where a vertical marker would have been visible from great distances, both inland and from the water. Such visibility implies that the menhir served as more than a local symbol, possibly acting as a territorial marker, a ceremonial focus, or a cosmological reference tied to movement of people, seasons, or celestial events. The reasons for the stone's collapse remain uncertain because there is no clear evidence of deliberate destruction, and it may have fallen due to structural failure, ground movement, or seismic activity, breaking into several large pieces that were never re-erected. What is significant is that after its fall, the site was not erased or abandoned entirely, but continued to exist within the cultural memory of the region, its fragments reused in later monuments nearby, including passage tombs, suggesting that the stone retained meaning even in broken form. This reuse reflects a worldview in which materials carried memory and where the power of a monument could be redistributed rather than lost, allowing the menhir's presence to persist through transformation rather than permanence alone. The base of the Grand Menhir thus becomes more than a foundation, because it marks the point where intention met execution, where human effort reached its maximum expression in stone, even if that expression did not survive intact. Standing at the site today, one becomes aware that the scale of the achievement lies not only in the size of the stone, but in the decision to attempt it at all, to organize labor, knowledge, and belief around a project that offered no practical return in shelter or sustenance. The absence of decoration or inscription reinforces the idea that meaning was carried by form and effort rather than narrative, and that the act of raising the stone was itself the message. In the broader context of European prehistory, the Grand Menhir represents a moment when communities were capable of extraordinary coordination, yet chose to express that capability through a single silent vertical gesture rather than through enclosure or density. Its fall does not diminish its significance, because the broken fragments and prepared base still communicate the same essential truth, that early societies possessed both the technical skill and the collective motivation to reshape their world on a monumental scale. Loch Mariachar reminds us that prehistoric monuments were not always meant to last forever, and that meaning could persist even when form failed, carried forward through memory, reuse, and continued presence in the landscape. The base of the Grand Menhir marks the point where ambition exceeded endurance, yet did not disappear, leaving behind a quieter but no less powerful record of human intention. And as the tides continue to move along the Brittany coast, reshaping shorelines and horizons, the empty socket where the stone once stood remains, holding space for a monument that no longer rises, but still defines the place through the magnitude of what was once achieved.